one of my favorite quotes says, "It's easier to fool someone than it is to convince someone that they have been fooled." And this is very true, especially when we look at the crime of child sexual abuse, and we look at how methodical predators are, and we look at how manipulative predators are, and we see how charming most predators are, and the fact that they work very hard at people's ability to trust them, right? And so when we look at grooming, and we're going to talk a lot about grooming, I'm going to show you through a lot of the grooming, through my own personal stories, just how effective grooming is. And it can happen in plain sight without you even knowing it. It can happen right under your nose, and you don't know what you don't know, right? So many times there are red flag grooming indicators that are happening in plain sight, and it takes someone that's been educated, someone that's aware, to stop that grooming cycle so that children and youth can make reports and get the help that they so desperately need. And so I will share some of those grooming examples, but for me, I was not an at-risk child. There is certainly something to be said for being at risk, but I was not an at-risk child in any way, shape, or form. I come from a good family. I attended a private Christian school growing up, but unfortunately, it's in this context, in this private school, where I first met evil. And my parents worked very hard and made a lot of financial sacrifices to make sure that these exact risks didn't happen. Yet, unfortunately, they still happened, right? Because we know that this crime is no respecter of persons, it's no respecter of socioeconomic status, it's no respecter of religion, it's no respecter of culture. It infiltrates communities, it infiltrates homes, it infiltrates places of worship, it infiltrates families. It infiltrates families. And we know the research has changed. It used to be, the research said that 90% of children and youth are sexually abused by someone they know and trust, and even it's sometimes someone that they love. But now that number has changed to 93%. So 93% of the time, a child or a youth is sexually abused by someone they know, someone they trust, and also sometimes someone that they love. And there's many reasons for that, and we're going to cover that today. Perpetrators work very hard to groom families. They groom the primary victim. They groom secondary victims. They groom institutions. They groom communities. They groom systems. It's very methodical, and they know exactly what they're doing. It's no misunderstanding. It's no mistake. These are the kinds of things that they try to say in the courtroom. Their defense is that, oh, it was a misunderstanding or it was a mistake. No, because when you can prove grooming, grooming is corroboration. Because many times predators will get up on that witness stand and they will brag. They will brag about how they were the only one there for this child in a time of need. They will brag about how they filled a role in the child's life. They will brag about how they were an authority figure or a spiritual authority. And they will keep talking and they will show that there was a special relationship there. So when you're trained on what grooming is and how grooming can be corroboration, then that's a huge win when we look at investigations and prosecuting these types of crimes, because abuse never starts off, most of the time, as abuse itself. Abuse starts off as access, as trust, as displaying behaviors, pro-social behaviors. It never starts off as abuse itself. And so we're going to talk about a lot of those things. Because let's face it, no parent in their right mind would ever leave their child alone with someone that they didn't trust, right? And so they have to work really hard to gain access, to gain trust, to gain the respect of people that are responsible for that child or for that youth. And so grooming is a very calculated process. It seeks to normalize these inappropriate behaviors, okay? Breaking down boundary violations, reducing resistance, and of course, silencing disclosures. So then many perpetrators will move into post-abuse maintenance behavior. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well, because they know exactly what to say to the child or the youth to ensure their silence through fear and shame and intimidation. And looking back at my own story, there was a lot of non-contact sexual abuse through grooming that happened before the contact sexual abuse actually happened, right? So sometimes children and youth are groomed in person or online, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months and years before the predator finds that moment of vulnerability to strike, because that's what predators are looking for when they are trying to get to know the child or the youth. They're looking for vulnerabilities, they're looking for weaknesses. When we look at online grooming, there's two things that the research shows works most on young girls. Anybody want to guess what those two things are? So when we look at online grooming through the different types of child sexual abuse and exploitation and trafficking, there's two things that work most on young girls. The first is telling them that they're beautiful, and the second is saying that they love them. Surprisingly, they are asking for a way into their life, whether that be an emotional vulnerability, or they want to meet a physical need, or they want to fill a social role in their life and be some sort of authority figure for them, whether that be a coach or a pastor or a father figure. They're looking to fill some sort of role for that child or that youth, or somehow build self-esteem, right? So I'll give you an example. There was, in one case, now thank goodness this perpetrator has been sentenced to prison, but in one case, this perpetrator joined an eating disorder group online, okay, through social media. It was for young girls that had eating disorders, okay? And this predator was pretty smart because he's looking for low self-esteem, right? So he joins this eating disorder group and he starts to get to know some of the girls, and from that he was able to complement and really groom specific girls, and then narrowed it down to one specific victim. And through that relationship, filling that emotional need, building that self-esteem online, was able to meet up with her in person, and you can guess where I'm going from here. So it's really that easy for predators to do this type of grooming online. It used to be we had to worry about grooming in person, right, Eric? It was just look for this in-person grooming. And that is still very evident. We can still see this clearly. But now there's a whole online world that we need to be teaching our youth about. We need to be teaching our students on online safety, and that's part of what Jenna's Law does here in Texas. And then also other states now have adopted this policy, and so that's exactly what this legislation does, is it teaches body safety and awareness in person and online, especially when it comes to grooming. Because the research shows in a sample of 99 adult child abuse victims, okay, they found that 99% of them had at least one grooming incident, which means that now we can say that sexual grooming is synonymous with sexual abuse, because most perpetrators use some form of sexual grooming. So this is from Dr. Jeglick, and her research is incredible, and it really goes in to show in detail the different types of sexual grooming that predators will utilize. And what's interesting about grooming is that you'll never be able to identify it if you haven't learned about what it is. It wasn't until afterwards, when my parents learned about grooming, it was hindsight. It was so clear that this is what was happening, that all these moments had been planned, they had been calculated, they had been strategized, they had all been premeditated. And so I'll give you an example. For me, when it moved from non-contact into contact abuse, it happened right in front of my own home, because he planned ahead of time. I was over at my friend's house. Okay, so this perpetrator was my best friend's father. And so we were over there all of the time, hanging out, spending time together. We were in the same extracurricular activities together. They lived right down in the neighborhood across the street from us. And so it was very convenient to be around this family. And unfortunately, my parents let this family into our lives, and we spent holidays with them, weekends with them, every special occasion we were with them, okay? And my parents wouldn't ever think anything of it, that they weren't a safe family, that this person wasn't a safe person, until they learned about grooming. So there was one incident that happened out of many where he called my dad and offered something very kind, right? My dad said, "Oh, well, don't worry about, bringing her home today. I will drop her off if that's okay with you," because I had been at my friend's house. It was late at night, and sure, that saves my dad a trip, right? I don't have to go pick her up. He will bring her up. He will bring her by. So that was the first time, unbeknownst to me, that it moved from non-contact to contact. And unfortunately, it was right in front of my own home. He parked the car. It was dark outside, it was low lit lighting, and the door was locked, and then that was the first time where he laid his hands on me. And I felt that I would never be the same after that. I felt feelings of guilt and blame and shame and fear, paralyzing fear. And there was no amount of showering I could do to get that dirty, clammy feeling off of me. And of course, I was threatened not to tell. This is part of why predators get to know the victim, is because they want to know, well, what is it that they fear losing? What is it that I can use against them, right? Because that's the thing I'm going to threaten them with. And so my life was threatened. I was told I would never be believed. And so there's only so many things that perpetrators can say to victims to keep them in silence and to keep them in fear and to keep them in intimidation. And so when we can show these things in the body safety trainings, it makes it very clear what's happening to them when they are unaware of what's happening to them, because many victims are unable to self-identify. Right? If you ask a survivor, are you being sexually abused or is someone harming you? They might say no. But when you start showing them the list of red flag grooming indicators, they might say, yeah, actually, this is happening. Something like this is happening to me. And so this is part of why it's important to understand what grooming is like and understand the grooming process and how to interrupt it, not just as safe adults, but also for students and youth, which is what Jenna's Law does. And there's been a lot of tremendous success stories that have come out of the trainings that are done here, just through this advocacy center, when they go in and they train the students and they train the youth on reporting. And it's really beautiful to see that those reports are made when they otherwise would not have been made if they hadn't had the Jenna's Law training. And so it's very key that this training is working. The perpetrator, let's talk about perpetrators for a minute. Many times it's not the person in the van that looks like they would be a threat, right? Many times it's the charming person, it's the authority figure, it's the family man. Many predators are married and they have children of their own, the research shows. So we have to start really looking for these key indicators because it's not what you would think. There's a lot of false stereotypes on who predators actually are. So most predators are family men, they have children of their own, many of them are married. And you would never know it if you didn't know what to look for. It would happen in plain sight. And so for me, that was the case. He was a family man, a member of his church, and had a very good job, lived in a very nice community. And there were other victims besides myself. Okay, for my court case, I was the only victim, but afterwards I found out there were more, because there's always more. Your average predator has anywhere from 7 to 9 victims. And then you have your serial predators that have hundreds of victims. And they're so skilled at what they do. They're so skilled at grooming, and they're so skilled at silencing victims, and they're so skilled at post-abuse maintenance behavior that they can silence hundreds of victims. And then you see these cases that come out on the news. You see the Larry Nassars and the Sandusky cases. And you're like, how is it that 100 girls or 100 boys never told? Well, I'll teach you how. It's actually very simple, because as soon as a predator can silence one victim, it's an ego boost for them. So now they know, well, I silenced this victim. I'm pretty good at this. So it's pride. So then they know they can silence other victims. And they're very skilled at what they do. Well, of course, we understand the effects of trauma, right? We understand the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. We know that trauma affects the mind and the body, and we also know that trauma affects the spirit. And that happened to me in every way, shape, or form. I changed physically, I changed emotionally, I changed spiritually. Every part of my core being was different from the trauma. I went from being very outgoing, very happy, and making good grades, very social, very talkative, to being very withdrawn, very depressed. I wasn't sleeping at night. I had night terrors. My grades were falling, and I looked like a completely different person. And unfortunately, it didn't stop there. I just continued to spiral. When we look at what those warning signs are, if a child may have been sexually abused, I had most of those blaring warning signs, okay? And I'll share a very personal moment with you later when I was having my SANE exam, and I was all summed up on one page of bullet points. So I'll share that moment with you in a minute. But unfortunately, I suffered in every way, and I learned that what's kept in silence has power over you. And silence and shame, fear and intimidation are the enemy's weapon of choice. This is what predators use to silence victims, to silence communities, to silence families. And I learned that we can't heal what we don't reveal. And that goes for us as an individual, but also as a society and as a community. We have to reveal these things if we have any hope of redemption, if we have any hope for healing. And what we don't expose, we empower. And I learned this the hard way. It almost killed me. I was extremely suicidal. At age 16, my bags were packed for a mental hospital because my parents couldn't keep me from harming myself. 99% of the time, if a youth is self-inflicting harm on themselves, and there's many ways to do this, if there is self-inflicted wounds on the body, 99% of the time, that child or youth has experienced sexual abuse in some way, shape, or form. That's a big red flag, because that's that anger turned inward and a desperate attempt to feel in control of the pain. And it's also a form of self-punishment, because part of the trauma that goes along with this spiritually is that sense of deep shame, that false sense of shame and blame and fear and guilt, and that sense of condemnation, because there's a difference. There's a difference between shame, there's a difference between guilt, and there's a difference between condemnation, right? So I'll teach you the difference really quickly. The difference is guilt says I've done something wrong. Maybe I missed my mom's birthday, or I forgot to show up somewhere I was supposed to show up. That's guilt. Guilt says I did something wrong and I feel bad for that, okay? So guilt is about your due. But shame is about I am. Shame internalizes what's happened and attributes that to the core of who you are. So shame says I am wrong, I am fundamentally flawed. But condemnation is the devil's playing ground, because condemnation is much more severe than guilt or shame. Condemnation says, I have done something wrong, I am fundamentally flawed, and I deserve punishment. And I have already ruled out my own sentencing on what I believe I deserve for punishment. And so that's very much why we see self-inflicting harm that youth will do upon themselves. Youth group if you disclose, or you will ruin this whole family, or no one will believe you. And so they flip that responsibility onto the victim. And victims believe it because there is an inner sense of guilt that happens when you've been sexually abused, okay? Especially if you haven't told right away. And offenders will use that against children and youth. And they also want to point to things that they would fear, right? So you'll lose your mom if you tell, or you'll lose your uncle if you tell, or your cousin will not have an uncle anymore if it's a family member. And so they know what to do, which is what we call post-abuse maintenance behavior. They know what to say to keep that victim silent and to keep them wrapped in fear and in bondage. And unfortunately, what we see is that delayed disclosure is very high for this type of crime, because the deep pain of betrayal and the deep sense of shame and the deep sense of not feeling like anyone's going to believe them and not wanting to speak about these types of things, right? To even utter those words, to even speak what happened is a reminder, and it makes the reality true. It's much easier to suppress and minimize and deny, push it away into a quieter corner so that we don't feel like we can deal with this right now, right? And that's okay. That's part of how the brain survives trauma. That's part of how we survive this, right? And then we can speak when we feel safe enough, right? So everything that we are talking about is about interrupting cycles of fear. This is about fear versus safety, right? Because when a child or youth feels love, that's when they will open up. That's when you're going to get that disclosure. And that's what happened to me personally. So for me, there were many threats. I knew there would be consequences for loved ones, and this is a big one for delayed disclosure, and why children and youth don't tell, and why we see recanting so much is because many survivors will tell you they did not want to disappoint their parents. They don't want to disappoint their family. Why? Because they are assuming a false sense of responsibility for that, or for any consequences that may happen. And so I didn't want to disappoint my parents. And I was told I would not be believed, and my life was threatened. So of course, the beautiful thing about children and youth is that they believe what they're told. They believe what authority figures tell them, right? Everything is pure to the one who is pure in heart. So when you tell a child something, they will believe you. They will take you at your word. And so children believe these threats unless we show them and we expose the enemy's tactics and we show them the way that predators use post-abuse maintenance behavior. That's when freedom can happen. Also, it feels like a no-win scenario, right? Like, how do I tell and get justice and relief from this situation? But then also, how does my friend get to keep her father around at the same time? How can those things both coexist? And perpetrators know this, and so they use this known relationship with the victim's family and the community to their advantage, right? Body safety, education, prevention education conversations did not exist. So they didn't happen in my safe places, right? At home, I didn't have a body safety conversation because this was not a trend growing up. School didn't have a body safety conversation with me. My church never had a body safety conversation with me. And so because this was never mentioned in any of my safe places, I concluded this must be something that's better left unspoken. And that's the message that we send to children and youth when we aren't the first ones, when we aren't the conversations. They are age appropriate, they are developmentally appropriate, and they save lives. The Jenna's Law training truly saves the lives of children and youth, and it stops that grooming cycle when we see that it's happening in person and online. But unfortunately, the abuse got so bad and it was so devastating that several times I ended up in the emergency room because my body broke out in hives all over. That's how my body physiologically responded to the sexual assault, was through a hives outbreak. And even when I was at the hospital in the emergency room, the predator's wife came to check on me. and said, "Is there anything we can do to help? We're praying for you. We hope you'll be okay." And this is many children and youth's reality. But unfortunately, my doctor's visits, my hospital visits did not stop at the emergency room. My parents, my teachers, the people who cared about me most were scratching their heads at this point, very confused. And the big question was, what is wrong with Jenna? There was a lot of confusion around what's wrong with this young girl? What could be happening to her? Why is she so disturbed? Why isn't she sleeping? Why is she having demonic night terrors at night? Why is her body giving away? Why does she look different? Why has she gained weight? Why is her hair falling out? Why doesn't she have light in her eyes anymore? Because at this point, and you've seen the look, you know the look, I could barely carry on a conversation with anyone. My head was hung low, shoulders slumped over. You know that look of shame. It's just lights out. There's no one there. My nickname in class was Zoner, because I might be here, but I'm not here physically. I'm not here mentally. So everybody knew clearly there was something wrong with this young girl, and I just decided that it would be best just to end it. And a lot of survivors, unfortunately, have chosen that route because they don't see a clear path forward. They don't see a clear way out of the mess, out of the isolation, out of the fear, out of the trauma, out of the bondage that holds you. But something really special happened. I have an acronym for faith. It's full assurance in the heart. It's what you know to be true, even though you can't prove it, you can't see it, but you know that there is something there. You just can't explain it. And for me, that's faith. It's full assurance in the heart. And we did what we always did during the holidays. We spent Christmas Eve with the perpetrator's family because we were very close with them. And we spent Christmas Day with the perpetrator's family. So the day after Christmas, my older sister, Stephanie, came and said, "Hey, let's go to lunch. Let's spend some time together," because she had just had her first year away at college. And I missed my big sister. I wanted to know, what's college like? Tell me that there's hope outside of this town, outside of the life that I'm living right now. And I did go to lunch with her, and it was a very special lunch. We were talking, and I'm asking her all these questions about college, and then she gets very serious and her tone changes, and she says, "Jenna, I'm going to ask you a question and you have to promise to tell me the truth." And of course, as a younger sister, I am thinking, oh my gosh, I borrowed her brand new top and I didn't put it back in her closet in the right spot, or I borrowed her jewelry or accessories. I mean, anybody with daughters or sisters knows that borrowing clothes and accessories is just a regular thing, right? So I'm thinking something very trivial at this point. And I said, yes, it can't be that bad, right? Whatever I'm committing to promising, it can't be that bad. So I say, yes, I promise to tell you the truth. And she asked me a question that changed my life forever. And it was very simple and it was very open-ended, and I hope that you'll remember this in your own lives. And she said, "Has anyone ever hurt you?" And it was so simple, but the timing was right. And that day, love won, right? It's only love that casts out fear. It's perfect love that casts out fear. It was that sense of love, it was that sense of safety that was provided to me by my sister, that I said, not a single word. I just started crying. I didn't say anything. I could not hold the tears back. But I knew that by crying, I had given her an answer. And she let me gain my composure for a minute, and then I tried to recant, right? Because that fear came back. It's like I had a moment of love, I had a moment of that sense of safety, but then that fear gripped me. And then I started, speaking all the things, I started rehearsing all the things that I had been told. So I said, you know this person well, and you wouldn't believe me even if I told you. And I would get in a lot of trouble. Like I just She knew that I had changed so much. The trauma had changed me down to my very core. And she wasn't going to let me live like that anymore. So she put her foot down and she made me commit to telling her who it was. Now, in her own mind, she thought, maybe it's bullying at school, maybe there's a boyfriend. I mean, there's no way she was thinking criminal activity, right? Because nobody wants to think that that's a possibility. Nobody wants to think that this could be the reason for why a child or a youth is struggling day to day. But we have to start thinking that way. And, she did everything right without having proper training on how to respond to an outcry, except there was one thing she did not have training on, and that is, girl, watch your face. Watch your nonverbal reaction, right? So I said, okay, I'm going to tell you. And I told her, and she was like, she had to cover her mouth because her jaw dropped as low as it could go. But then after that, she believed me, and she said, you did the right thing in telling. And, she said, we're going to tell mom and dad, this isn't going to happen again. And I did what a lot of young I don't want any, all of the fears, right? All of the fears that you have for telling, and all of the community responses and institutional backlash and things that happen. And so I tried to keep it, let's just keep this a secret, which is what a lot of youth do. But she was not going to have that. She was not going to have that. She put her foot down. And I'm so grateful that she did. So we had a family meeting that night, and we called my parents together, and my younger sister went to a different room. And even then, she could barely get it out of me. She had to be there to prompt it. And there's no words, of course, for how my parents felt, right? They made a lot of sacrifices to put me in private school, financially, to make sure this didn't happen. And then here we go. Here it is. The fear of all fears for parents. And being in Texas here, my dad, after I disclosed, he got up from the couch. He didn't say, he's a man of very few words. So he got up from the couch and he said, I'm just going to go talk to him. And he grabbed his coat and he grabbed his .38 revolver. And he was just going to go talk to him. And we knew that that was not going to be a good talk whatsoever. So actually the only reason that we called 911 was for my dad. He called 911 for himself, which good for him, because we all can make a bad situation worse when we find these things out, right? Like, I entrusted you, you were one of my best friends, how could you do this? I let you into my home, all of the things, right? And all of the multiple places that it happened. And that was one of the things that, people will try to do. My parents tried to say, well, how many times? Well, how often? And it's just really overwhelming because they wanted details right then and there, and I wasn't giving it to them because I'm emotionally overwhelmed, right? So you can picture the scene. And, so thank goodness he was able to call the police for himself, and he said, you better get over here, and you better get over here quick before I do something about this. So he's calling help for himself. I need backup for myself, because that's the father's heart. So that night, everything changed, right? Now everyone's going through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and that deep pain of betrayal. And so things got worse before they got better, which is very normal, right? So now I see my parents are crying. Now I see they're depressed. Now I see they're hurting. And I feel like it's all my fault, right? And so my two options were either Green Oaks Mental Hospital or the Children's Advocacy Center. And I'm so grateful that I went to the Children's Advocacy Center first before being checked into the mental health hospital, because it was really unbelievable. I mean, this was a place that was literally created specifically because of what I went through. If only I'd known something like that existed when I was going through the darkest moments in fear and in silence and in isolation, right? Fear and isolation is a lethal combination, those two together. If only I had known there was a place like this that existed. And so just specifically for what I went through. And so I was able to have the services, one-on-one counseling, group counseling with other girls, and court preparation, because that was a huge process, the court preparation process, and the SANE exam. So I'll tell you quickly what happened with the SANE exam. So my mom drove me to have the SANE exam done, and of course she's not in the room, it's just myself and the SANE nurse. But she's very nervous, so she's in the lobby of the waiting room, and she sees these little pamphlets, these educational pamphlets out in front of her. So to pass the time, she grabs one, and she reads it, and it says, "Warning signs a child may display if they've been sexually abused." And she got out a pen from her purse, and she starts to mark off over 80% of those warning signs. And as an educator, she was an elementary school teacher, if I had seen this as a mom or an educator, I could have stopped this from happening, or at least stopped it from happening for as long as it went on. I was all summed up on one page of bullet points. It was really that simple. She would have known to consider and ask the right questions, right? So it was very eye-opening how so much of this could have been prevented by watching those red flag grooming signs, and then also understanding what the traumatic effects are on the body and on the soul. As a professional educator, and then also from my experience not having opportunities to tell and not having body safety conversations in any of my safe places, the idea for Jenna's Law was born. And so in 2009, Governor Perry, our Texas Governor Perry, signed Jenna's Law into effect, and now over half the country has adopted a form of Jenna's Law legislation, and it recently passed federally. The Jenna Quinn Law is now federal legislation. And all because one survivor received help. There were people that were bold enough, that were brave enough to reach down and ask those hard questions, have those hard conversations, people that were able to fight for me when I couldn't fight for myself, when I didn't have the strength to make it through another minute or another day. And so you'll never really know the impact that you have, right? Because children and youth, when they're in that moment of crisis, they can't say thank you, they can't verbalize, right? But as my experience was validated, validation is so important. Victim advocacy is everything, okay? Victim advocacy is so important. Don't ever think that it's some small job, because it is an enormous job, okay? Healing cannot happen apart from a sense of safety and validation. Validation says, I see you, I believe you, and I'm going to stay with you, and I'm going to help you walk this road. Validation is so important, affirming what they've been through, affirming not only that it happened, but the effects that it brought into their life as well. Validating those two things will put survivors on a path to healing and hope and restoration and safety. Now, once the validation happens, now we have to talk about restoring voice. Restoring voice is very important as well. And in the advocacy world, voice what is it that I need? Well, I don't know, because my voice has been silenced. My voice has been diminished. My voice has lived in survival for too long. My voice has lived in fear for too long, so I don't have the ability to identify my needs, let alone express those needs. So first, when we talk about voice, we have to look at identifying what those needs are, and then we have to look at the ability to express those needs. Well, what is it that you need? And so that's why having a victim advocate is life-changing, because you can foresee and identify those most common needs that survivors don't know. They're not aware that they need, okay? Because the communication's not happening in that self-talk. So it's very important, the validation. And then the court preparation is also very key. So this predator did what many predators do, and that is that he filed for several continuances, right? So as soon as you have had your court preparation services and you're mentally prepared, because it is a mental game, you're mentally prepared to walk into the courtroom, they say, okay, continuance, continuance. So he did that 4 times to the family before the judge put his foot down and said, no more continuances. This is our final day that we are going to be going to court. And so the multidisciplinary team did a beautiful job in helping with my case on a case-by-case basis, because the jury ended up giving him 70 years in prison, right here in Denton County. Judge Shipman. If you remember Judge Shipman, he's retired now, but God bless him. He did a beautiful job, and that was, I cannot tell you what that did to see this person walk out into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffs and ankle shackles. That's a visual a survivor will never forget, because that visual says what happened to you was wrong. It wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything to bring this on, right? All of the things that we want survivors to not just know, but believe in their hearts that it wasn't your fault. And it helps the healing process. It truly helps the healing process. And so, you know, the investigators, everybody working together on that case made a big difference for me to be able to continue on, and then now advocating for others and teaching in all of these workshops. And being able to help now, you know, shape legislation and child safety policies. When there was a day had anyone say thank you, I want to thank you today and tell you that I love you, truly love you, and believe in what you're doing. And don't ever think that it doesn't matter or that it's not making a difference, because it is. It truly is. Because children and youth, they don't stay children and youth. They grow up. And they're one day going to enter into a relationship, and they'll one day enter into the workforce, and they'll one day enter into a community. And what kind of interactions will that be? What kind of interactions will they have? What ripple effect will that have if they haven't had that trauma healed? So it's a huge ripple effect that this crime has on our society, not just on an individual victim, but on society itself. And it's really important for us to understand that every child matters. I'm just one child that went through the services of this Children's Advocacy Center. Imagine what all of the others will go on to do with their lives.